The climate of an area is the prevailing weather patterns in a specific region. And so this is created, the climate is an overall combination of the impacts of temperature, precipitation, wind, and light. So some of our physical features of our environment kind of interact with each other to create this climate pattern. And this relates to biomes. Biomes are the major types of habitats that we have across the globe and the communities of organisms that live in them. And the biomes are really determined by the climate of the area. Climate and biomes follow a really strong equatorial trend, and this largely has to do with the temperature difference that we talked about, with the solar radiation being stronger at the equator and less strong at the poles. This difference in temperature caused by that difference in solar radiation then also affects atmospheric circulation of air, and then that impacts precipitation patterns. And so all of those interactions lead to the trend that it is much warmer and more moist at the equator. So your equatorial regions have the highest amount of precipitation and the warmer temperatures. And so as you move away from the equator in either direction, you have progressively lower temperatures and less precipitation at different seasons. So there's seasonal impacts and all that stuff too, but as a simplification. And then in addition to the general equatorial trends, there is also big impacts from elevation differences and proximity to bodies of water. So we'll take a closer look at those now. So the first of those is elevation. Elevation has a strong impact on climate patterns in two ways. So adiabatic cooling is that increased elevation leads to a drop in temperature. So this affects the temperature, which affects a lot of stuff, as we know. So a 10 degrees Celsius drop for every 1,000 meters higher will cause this lower average temperature. And so in Colorado, this is a major impact. So the mountains of Colorado are significantly cooler at any time of year than down here in the plains. So any given day, you would see an average lower temperature in the mountains than here down in Denver. The other thing that mountains do, in addition to adiabatic cooling, is they affect the movement of precipitation. And so what you have is what's called the Rainshadow. So on one side of the mountains, that will tend to have all of the precipitation released on it. So as the moist air rises up the edge of the mountain, it causes the precipitation to come out of it. And so as the clouds travel across the mountains, they tend to drop all of their moisture on one side of the mountains and then not have very much left on the other side of the mountains. And so you tend to have a lot of moisture on one side and almost none on the other. And in Colorado, this is a big impact. So a lot of our storms, especially in the wintertime, come from the Pacific carrying moist air. And as they hit the western side of the Rocky Mountains, they drop almost all of their precipitation. And as those clouds then proceed across the mountains and onto the eastern plains, there's almost no precipitation left in them. And so what you have is a lot of snowpack in the western side of the mountains, also called the Western Slope, and then a very dry region of the Great Plains on the other side of the Rocky Mountains. Proximity to a large body of water is overall a temperature moderator. So coastal areas are always just more moderate. They tend to be less hot and less cold. And that's because of the interaction of the water as far as warm air and cool air absorbing warmth and letting warmth go. So during the day, the land is heating up. And that warm air is coming up and out, and that pulls in cool air. And so you get like a cooling sea breeze off of the water, and so that cools during the day. But then at night, an opposite pattern happens, and so you actually get it being warmer at night on land than over the water. And so that keeps the temperatures very moderate. So the climate collectively, so all of these things, the position of the equator, the global circulation, elevation, relative closeness to a large mass of water, all of those things are impacting the organisms that can live in that region. And we collectively call this kind of pattern, climate pattern, and the organisms that live there, a biome. So terrestrial biomes, land-based biomes, are heavily influenced by annual precipitation and temperature. They're the two most biggest impacts. And again, other things come into it, but those are the two biggest ones. And so if you just look at temperature on the x-axis and annual precipitation on the y-axis, the range of temperature and precipitation, where those things kind of interact, is what gets you the different major biomes. So for example, let's look at this green one here. When you have average temperatures between, here and here, and precipitation between here and here, that is classified as a temperate deciduous forest. So this would be places like on the East Coast, places like Tennessee, North Carolina, have temperate deciduous forest as their dominant biome. Tropical rainforest, by comparison, is both warmer, so notice the average temperature region that it's in, and has higher precipitation. And so that's what makes it a tropical rainforest, is that combination of very high precipitation and warm temperatures. Now, if we go down, we're still in the high temperature range, so still over here on temperature on the x-axis, but way down here for precipitation on the y-axis, so very little precipitation, that would be the hot desert. So that's a place like the Sahara. So that's how those two things interact to form the major biomes. So we see a global distribution of those biomes. And so notice that a lot of the biomes follow that equatorial trend. So see how they're almost going across horizontally. So here is hot desert. Here is tropical grassland. And again, kind of stripping across there. But notice that it doesn't always follow that pattern, especially when you have a mountain range. So we see some mountain ranges indicated here, and mountain ranges can change that pattern. Taking a closer look at the United States, we can see that we have temperate deciduous forest, temperate grassland. There's a mountain range. We have cold desert here, and then some more temperate grassland along the edge here. And so we get some of this unique patterning here because of the Rocky Mountains has a big impact on North America. So taking a look at these different biomes that are present, I've just got an interesting point for you here. Which of the biomes in the U.S. is most endangered? Most people will automatically assume that it's forest, whether that be a temperate deciduous forest here. There's actually a little bit of rainforest up here in Washington State, like Olympic National Park, for example. People oftentimes assume it's these forested areas. But in reality, the grassland is actually, not only is it the most endangered, it's actually mostly extinct. There's very little native grassland left in the United States, and that has to do with farming. So most of native grassland was plowed under at some point, and so even in areas that are now preserved, they're no longer native prairie or native grassland because they were disrupted by farming. So they tend to be more of a mix of forage crops that were once planted for, like, for example, cattle, and maybe some natives mixed in there, but there's actually very little native prairie and undisturbed prairie left in the United States. Whereas forest has tended to be better preserved. So especially if you look across the Western United States, you have the BLM, the Bureau of Land Management, the National Forest Service, the USDA, as well as national parks, of course, as well, that have preserved major tracts of these of the forested areas in particular. And while some of those forested areas might be used to some degree for human use, for example, if there's logging in the national forest, that human use is limited and controlled by the federal government, and that has served to protect that biome considerably more than when you travel east of the Mississippi River, where you have a lot less of the conservation and more in private land ownership, and you don't always have and especially with the grassland, this ended up in almost all private hands due to the colonization of the West and the settlement of the West and westward expansion. Okay, so I can't talk about climate without addressing climate change briefly. So human activities are increasing the greenhouse effect. So as we talked about, there's atmospheric gases like CO2 and methane are two major ones, as well as a whole host of other ones, but those are the two you hear the most about, that humans have been having a large impact on the amount of those gases in the atmosphere. So we see the levels of CO2 in particular have increased greatly over the last 200 years, but especially even just the last 60 years. And this is due to the burning of fossil fuels. So fossil fuels are the trapped carbon that plants trapped millions and millions of years ago. So remember that plants use photosynthesis to pull CO2 out of the atmosphere, and then they use that to build their bodies. And if they decay, then that CO2 gets released back into the environment. But in the case of fossil fuels, that plant matter, and it can happen with animal matter as well, but that carbon that was trapped by those organisms, the carbon gets stuck in their bodies and it gets buried into the Earth's surface and pressurized and all kinds of stuff I don't understand that turns it eventually into fossil fuels. But that's why we call it fossil fuels. It's actually the remains of living things. So it's carbon that's the remains of living things. And when we burn that fossil fuel, we're releasing the carbon that used to be buried under the Earth's surface into the atmosphere at a rate that's very fast, right? Because this thing that would have taken, hundreds of years to decay, depending on the organism, is now being released instantaneously. And so that CO2 is a greenhouse gas. And so as the rates of CO2 in the atmosphere have increased, it's been warming the Earth more. So remember, that's reflecting the warmth back onto Earth. It's like this big blanket. And we want some blanket, but we don't want too much blanket. And this excess CO2 is creating too much of a blanket. And so what we're seeing is an increase in the global average temperature. And that has been called global warming. So we're not saying that it's always a ton hotter, right? And every year you can have fluctuation based on things like El Nino and La Nina and all this stuff like that. But at an average, you see that the temperature across the globe is increasing. And so this term global warming was the term that was first used because it was capturing just that temperature change. But we're really starting to now talk about climate change more because, as we've been talking about in this chapter, temperature is this hugely important physical feature of the environment and has a major impact on the overall climate. And so this increase in temperature is really changing the climate. It's changing the circulation, air circulation patterns. And so that's going to change the precipitation patterns. That's going to change wind patterns. So all of these other features of the climate are going to be impacted by global warming. And so that's why we're calling it climate change. That's also what makes it really hard to predict, though. So when we talk about, what is the Earth going to be like in 2050 or 2100, because of this increase in global temperatures, we're trying to predict what will happen to wind, what will happen to ocean currents, what will happen to precipitation patterns. And as you know, weather is hard to predict. So even with really good computer programs and stuff, and just looking at a 7-day forecast. So think about the 7-day forecast right now. If you go onto that 7-day forecast, it's going to tell you, okay, it's going to be this temperature on this day and that temperature on that day and all that. And a lot of times they're not right. Or they're going to say, okay, it'll only be an inch of snow and it's actually 7 inches. Or they say it's going to be 14 inches of snow and it's only 2 inches of snow. So our ability to predict weather is not super great. And so that's the kind of scary unknown about climate change, is that we are not that good at predicting climate and weather. And so it's a little bit of a big unknown. And that's why you see so much variability. It's not because the scientists are not clear that their global warming is occurring. And it's not because they're not sure that climate change is happening and going to continue to happen. The only question, the only uncertainty is what the climate change is going to look like. What is Colorado going to be like? It's probably not going to be exactly the same climate that we have now. We are just not sure. And in fact, if you go and look at the estimates for Colorado, Colorado is in a particularly big unknown area, and I think that is because of our mountains and our elevation, all that kind of stuff. But they're really not sure if Colorado is going to get more rain, or more snow or less snow. They're really not sure about a lot of regions. We're in the range of uncertainty. And so that's the hard truth about climate change. We know it's happening. We know it's going to impact all living things on Earth. We're just not sure how it's going to impact biomes, and how it's going to impact humans, and how bad that impact is going to be.